So if we take a look at the subframe and where the sway bar bushing meets up to it, you can see that it is clearly snapped off right there. Unfortunately, that calls for replacing the subframe, as I do not have the part that can be welded back on. So I began by disconnecting the tie rods. They are held on by one 17mm nut, and all you got to do is take that off. The same thing applies to the control arm, however they are 19mm nuts. And then you just get a pickle fork and wedge it in between the joint of the strut and the tie rod. And I did the same thing to the other side. As for the control arm, you want to take out the 19mm nut holding it on the top to the strut, and then take out its sway bar link. That is held on by a 17mm nut. Once you do that, you can pry it apart with a pickle fork, and your control arm is free from the strut assembly. And I did the same exact thing to the other side. With the drop link free from the control arm, you can now take out the little nut and bolt holding on the sway bar bushing. It's a 13mm nut and a 13mm bolt, and they attach to the tab of the subframe. On the one side, I was missing it, so that's why I have to take this all apart in order to replace the subframe, as well as the sway bar and all the other suspension components. With the bolt and nut out, you can just yank the sway bar itself, and it'll pry right down from the subframe. Now it's time to disconnect the control arms from the frame of the car. They are held on by two 17mm bolts. These are easily taken out with a gun or a wrench. It's up to you. With the bolts out, all you gotta do is give the control arm a good yank, and it'll come right out. And you can see I slid the sway bar out of the way. It's just one more thing to have out of the way for me, so it makes it a little bit easier. And it's the same exact process on the other side. And now I drop the sway bar out of the car. As far as the steering rack goes, I began by draining it to prevent all the fluids from leaking out on the floor when I go to drop it down. You want to take out these two banjo bolts here. The top one is a 19mm and the bottom one is a 22mm. And have a catch pan ready because the fluids will come out quick. With the fluids draining, you now want to move on to the steering knuckle. It is held on by a 13mm nut and bolt that is easily removed with a wrench and a ratchet. With the nut and bolt removed, you can attempt by prying open the joint with a screwdriver, but I had better luck with just taking a pickle fork and jamming it in between the joint and then prying it out. Now it's time to take the steering rack out of the subframe. You want to remove that 15mm bolt as well as that 15mm bolt. Then there's a 15mm nut on top of each bolt that you're going to have to remove. It can be a little tricky to find, but once you get it, you'll be able to take out the steering rack. Now the next part is long debated, but the best way to drop the steering rack from the subframe without having to take out the subframe is to take a pair of vice grips and bend the tabs of the subframe away from the steering rack. Now, in my case, I'm going to be replacing the subframe, so it doesn't matter what happens to these tabs. But if you're going to keep your subframe in the car, you want to avoid what I did, and that is curling the subframe with the vice grips. You want to try to bend them as straight as possible, so you want to try to get like a needle nose pair of vice grips or a needle nose pair of pliers in order to bend it down. Once you have it bent down, then you can drop the steering rack out of the car. So I was pretty happy with the progress that I made in one night, and so all I did was take out the oil pan drain plug, and it's easily taken out with a 17mm wrench, and I let it sit overnight to ensure that all the oil drained out of the oil pan, so when I drop down the pan to do the gasket, there's as minimal oil in there as possible. And have a catch pan ready to catch the oil, because you don't want it to go on your garage floor or any floor that you're working on. And that's what dirty oil looks like. I used Castrol GTX 5W30 for my summer oil, which I'm now learning wasn't really the good oil to use, but it was fully synthetic, so I didn't have to change it for a long time. I'm now using Castrol GTX 10W40 due to the fact that that's what they recommend for the winter, as well as a part synthetic motor oil, and it only lasts about, I'd say about 5,000 miles, or 4 months, whatever one comes first. And I let that sit overnight, and now it's time for me to get some rest because I got a lot of work ahead of me tomorrow.